This session is on legal and ethical issues in clinical trials and research.
We would like to invite our esteemed panelists on stage. Mr. A.K. Pradhan, Deputy Drugs Controller, CDSCO North Zone. Dr. C.D. Tripathi, Professor and Head Department of Pharmacology, VMCC and Safdarjung Hospital. Dr. Pramod Garg, Professor, Department of Gastroenterology and Sub-Dean Research Section, AIIMS, New Delhi. And Dr. Khalid Khan, Managing Director, Firmish Clinical Technologies, Noida. We would also like to welcome the moderator of the panel discussion, Dr. Y.K. Gupta, Professor and Head of Pharmacology Department, AIIMS, New Delhi.
Thank you. We now request Professor Y.K. Gupta to kindly moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Now, we are going to have this session on clinical trial and clinical research, ethical issues, and some legal issues. Those who understand the clinical research and clinical trial scenario in India, if you recall, there was negligible clinical trial used to be done about 15 years back. A lot of clinical trial started, and then India was considered as hub for clinical trial. And the reasons were that India has a maximum number of doctors who can communicate effectively in English as compared to China and other part of the world. There is a huge population which is a treatment navy, where you can test the new compound or the new drug, or you can compare these with other intervention. There is adequate infrastructure, medical colleges and hospitals. And lastly, most importantly, the cost of hospitalization, cost of treatment, and the cost of study is much cheaper, and therefore economical clinical trial. But then, when so many trials started, there were some wrongdoing happened, inadvertently sometimes, and sometimes people did unethically, which resulted in huge noise in parliament, press, and also the patient or NGOs. This resulted in lot of regulatory reforms which followed in clinical trial. And that changed the entire scenario in the country. And we are fortunate that we are having among the panelists Mr. A.K. Pradhan, who is a Senior Deputy Director General of DCGI Office, Drugs Controller General, and who was involved in framing these regulations intensely. We have with us Professor Garg, Professor Pramod Garg, who has been chairing the All India Institute of Medical Sciences Ethics Committee, and therefore handling this, and Dr. C.D. Tripathi, who is a professor of pharmacology and chairing couple of ethics committee in Delhi, and has been involved in regulatory process in DCGI, Drugs Controller General India Office. Now, as we know that when you do clinical trial, your purpose is to compare the two intervention or to try a new drug or new intervention. And in this process, there are following important points. One is the investigator who does the investigation or who does the study. The second is the site where he does the study. And third is the sponsor who asks the study to be conducted. It may be the industry, it can be ICMR, it can be the investigator himself. I would, and most importantly, to oversee everything is the ethics committee. And therefore, ethics committee's role is a major issue. So I would just put this issue first to Dr. C.D. Tripathi. what he thinks is the role of institutional ethics committee, and then I would put that the same question in a different perspective. What has been the experience of handling the institutional ethics committee to Dr. Garg? So maybe Dr. Tripathi, you can throw light on how you think that the institutional ethics committee can effectively supervise, and what is its role in conducting a trial.
Thank you, sir, for giving this opportunity. When you talk about the clinical trials, the center point or center pillar of all the clinical trials is the ethics committee. Now, ethics committee could be a different, say for you call in All India Institute or big academic institutions or even the good corporate hospitals, there the working is different. But same thing if you go for other institutions where there are some, you call it independent type of ethics committee which are looking after the clinical trials in their areas, or even in the condition where the trial is in the community. Even in good hospital, the trial site is community. Then the issue of the ethics committee comes apart from looking after the initial part of the approval of the trial. The monitoring part is very crucial. If the trial site is within your institution, then it becomes much easier. If the trial site is outside the institution, say for even the medical institution, you have a lot of primary health centers. The trial could be those centers 15-20 kilometers away, or some independent ethics committee is monitoring trial based. Suppose the ethics committee in Gurgaon and trial sites are in different part of Haryana. So then the monitoring becomes very, very crucial part. And in the case where the enrollment is for the few months, say for there is a trial for vaccine, and then the 2 or 3 doses of vaccine has to be given to the child, and then that means the child has to be in the trial for a few months, and the vaccine has to be given just once a month and at interval. So the any serious adverse event related to the vaccines could be just initial few days minimal, and most of the time then the child may be having the illness not related to the trial drugs or vaccine. So here the role of ethics committee becomes very important. Whether the subject is getting the proper medical attention, which may be not related to the trials drug or vaccine, but also concomitant illness during the trial period. Because if the subject is during the trial period, then he should be taken care of all the medical facilities. So what I have observed that quite significant number of the ethics committee, they are not visiting to the trial site. So that is the real monitoring what is happening at the trial site, because the trial site, whether the doctors are really qualified which are supervising the trial subjects in between the intervention period. So sometimes that becomes very crucial, and any serious adverse event, naturally now this is obligatory on the part of the ethics committee to analyze them and to then give the recommendations. But even that monitoring part is very crucial, and sometimes what happens, although as a regulatory way, each ethics committee has to be re-registered after the period of some 3 years, I think. But I have the opportunity of doing the inspection of some clinical trial site and the ethics committee. And one ethics committee I went to visit, and I have to leave the vehicle 500 meters away. then walk through the gully and reach to the registered site of the ethics committee. And then I inquire, ki, where do you conduct the meeting? So meeting used to be conducted in the 5-star hotel. And then I ask whether you have any ethics committee member visited this office where all the data and everything is stored. There's nothing. So few years back, this type of ethics committee do existed, although their renewal has been cancelled, but this type of the things were happening in India. Yes, with the change in the regulations, lot of improvement is happening and is expected.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tripathi. Dr. Tripathi highlighted there are ethics committees, more than 1,200 which are registered under DCGI. But still, there are many ethics committees which are, I would call them, registered but bad, because they are not following the standard operating procedure. They are not supervising what the clinical trial is happening, how it is happening, whether the site is adequate or not. And that's what the experience of Dr. Tripathi when he did couple of audits and inspection of ethics committees, which is now becoming more and more frequent and will be mandatory after some time. Dr. Garg, Dr. Pramod Garg has been the Dean of Research and at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and also the Member Secretary of Ethics Committee, which is one of the best institution in the world, in the country, and one of the most dynamic SOP-based ethics committee in the country. Dr. Garg, what has been your experience, particularly dealing with the research projects or clinical trials submitted to ethics committee for this? Any message you would like to give to the administrators, to investigators, that this should not happen, this should happen?
Thank you, Professor Gupta, for this opportunity. There's no doubt that ethics committee is the most important regulatory body within the institution to make sure that research which is conducted in the institution is fair and justified. Most of the investigators actually feel that it's a hassle to go through the ethics committee. They're going to raise many objections about the study design and other things. But I can tell you that as an investigator, you must make sure that you follow the ethical committee guidelines, because this is ultimately going to protect you. You means the investigator. From the administrator point of view, I think it is very important that they have a well-constituted ethics committee in place, because ultimately if something goes wrong with any kind of research protocol, the onus is going to come to the administrator. So I think that's an important point, that they have to have a good ethics committee in place as mandated by the DCGI, the constitution of the ethics committee. The members should be well chosen. So there is no denying the fact that ethics committee is very, very important when your institution or hospital is engaging in any kind of research, mainly clinical trials. Of course, it's a challenge from the ethics committee point of view to make sure that whatever research project is approved by the committee is actually scientifically valid. And for that, the committee looks at many aspects of the protocol, and not one. There are many members who will go through the protocol simultaneously, and when the committee meeting takes place, everyone will give his or her opinion. Couple of points there would be that we will look at the scientific design. We will look at whether the study is actually justified to be conducted or not. We'll look at whether it's a new drug or a new device which requires more stringent criteria to be followed. We make sure that the basic principles of ethics in biomedical research are followed, namely autonomy, beneficence, malfeasance, and there has to be proper monitoring of all the serious adverse events. And we have a subcommittee in our institute which is chaired by actually Professor Y.K. Gupta to oversee all the side effects and adverse events during the conduct of a trial, and subsequent whether it requires any compensation or not. So there are many aspects governing the research, and if you are an administrator, I would urge you that you have to have ethics committee which is independent. Now, ethics committee has to be independent. Independent, that means there is nobody can influence the decision of the ethics committee. So as an administrator, you make sure that your hospital has a good ethics committee which is as per the DCGI norms and is independent. If you are an investigator, my request is that you make sure that you actually follow the ethical committee guidelines, because ultimately the ethics committee is going to protect you if something goes wrong during the conduct of the research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pramod. Dr. Pramod has highlighted, I think, the most important point, which he said that the ethics committee which you constitute should not be under you. It has to be independent. The ethics committee members have to have a courage to say that investigator, this is paid, and where you are doing wrong and where you are likely to do wrong. And therefore, the ultimate objective of ethics committee is to safeguard the interests of the patient or the subject, and also that each and every step of the trial is being done ethically. And if something wrong happens, then what he highlighted is that the compensation, if the clinical trial related injury happens, then it is the responsibility of the ethics committee to see how the compensation is being granted and how it is being followed up. Many times, most of the time, the clinical trials are sponsored trial, and these sponsored trials are from industry. Of course, the sponsored trial are also from the other agencies, maybe ICMR, DST, DBT, and WHO, UNICEF, but largely the drug trials are sponsored by the industry. Industry also gives sometimes non-regulatory trials or non-drug trial, or academicians also does that research. I have with us Dr. Khalid Khan, who represents not only industry but who also represents the CROs who get the trial done on behalf of industry at acclaimed or good clinical trial sites. So they are the people who contact the sponsor, remain in touch with the investigator because they are the person who are getting the trial done, and also monitor the site. So Dr. Khan, what are the challenges which you face and what is the perception of industry? Because I will give this mic to Mr. Pradhan later, because of the so many regulatory changes which are taking place. What you feel, is it being suffocating, or it's the clinical trial today is easy?
Thank you, thank you, sir, and thank you, Dr. Shakti Gupta, for giving us the opportunity to come and talk to the audience on this important subject. And it is just happens by chance that today is also a clinical trial day. Yeah. Yes. So, what I had observed since especially in last my 27 years of the career, when we have the amendment, clinical trial, amendment under Drugs and Cosmetic Act in 2005, which enables the industry to start the phase 3, especially phase 3 global trials and standalone trials. Then the country started getting the trial from outside India also, apart from the indigenous industry, and it peaks in 2011 and 12 when DCGI approves around normally at on the average of 250 clinical trials in a year. At that time, the regulation on especially on ethics and compensation were not really very stringent and well defined. That was the reason that there had been some cases and outcry in healthcare ecosystem of about conducting the clinical trial which were not ethical, and where the vulnerable population was used in a very unethical manner, and the court cases were filed, PIL were filed, and it's only after that the regulators in the country look into the matter and worked out on the various amendments. And the most important amendments which came in 2012 was about the ethics committee registration with the DCGI and the regulatory authority, and also about the compensation as well. So about which Mr. Pradhan will talk about it in more detail. So till 2012, we have seen a lot of trials have come, but then after that it slowed down, and then 2013 the amendment came, and then there were a lot of trials which were even taken out from the country to other different destination. And it's only in 2015 we have seen that now the number of clinical trials are improving and increasing, which we call it the regulated clinical trial. Trials on the new drug or the new medical devices and the vaccines, biologicals, which are regulated under Drugs and Cosmetic Act. So when we say that trials, clinical trial may be the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, for the unapproved drugs that comes under the regulations. Then there are also clinical trials where we do the PMS, post-marketing surveillance study, that also comes under the DCGI regulations. Then there are trials which we call it unregulated trial. For example, the trial of a nutraceuticals, trial of cosmetic, or trial of a medical device which is not regulated or covered under the Drugs and Cosmetic Act. So those trials which do not come under the preview of Drugs and Cosmetic Act, for those trials also we need to have a ethics committee approval. In fact, if anybody wanted to conduct a trial in India, the 2-3 things are very important. For regulated clinical trials, they must have the permission from the DCGI, NOC, or the permission from Drug Controller India. Second, it must be approved by the Institutional Ethics Committee. Third, it must be registered at the CTRI registry of the ICMR. For unregulated category of the clinical trial, it should be approved by the Ethics Committee, of course Institutional Ethics Committee, and it should be registered with the CTRI registry also, as per the law of the the country. So the drug development process had, from the industry perspective, has become so complicated, and it becomes so expensive. The average cost of a drug development today is about $1.2 billion, out of which 70% goes into the clinical development plan, which is a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And in our country, one of the reasons why we could not able to come out with a new NCE by Indian company, because we have a very few centers for the phase 1 study, and for phase 3 we have sufficient enough infrastructure, facility, and manpower, and skill, and human resources. But for phase 1, we do lag behind. That is what I feel is my thoughts are. And from the industry perspective, because the chunk of the money goes into it, so we have to see that the trials are, application are filed properly, and then approval is taken at the time, because the time is the money in that. The reason is the drug is already patented, which is for 20 years, and if we took a lot of time for conducting the phase 3 trials, then it means that the company is losing money. So it is important to see that the approval is obtained on time, the ethics committee approval is taken on the time, and we also observe that like in some of the institute, the ethics committee meet very regularly, every month, say for example, or every 3 weeks. But in some of the institute, they do, they do not held in a very regular manner, especially in the government institute and hospital, where we, as industry stakeholder, we have a challenge. So means that the trial in some of the places start early, and in some of the places it doesn't start early. And from the industry perspective, we also see that the ethics committee meetings perform and conducted properly, everything, because the new regulation is a binding on the sponsor also as far as the ethics is concerned. So it is very important. I mean, it's not that a sponsor or or the company, pharmaceutical company, can just once the clinical trial is approved by the DCGI, they can just be okay, fine, and then be free from the responsibility, which is not the case now. And that's the reason that industry had tied up with the insurance company for indemnification of the investigator, and also for the compensation part to the patient in case of clinical trial related injury or death. So those things were not in place a few years back, but now the insurance company also understand the model, and they do provide those instruments for the covering the indemnification and compensation to the patient. So I hope that clinical research, especially global clinical trial, will increase further, and the focus of the industry is about on the research of the prevention, that is the development of the newer vaccines for especially the the diseases where with the medical options are very less, and of course for unmet medical need like cancer, then Alzheimer disease, and some of the orphan drugs where the focus was not there earlier, but in time to come the focus is there also in our country for conducting clinical trials.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid, for giving us the perspective what industry has. And you rightly mentioned that the industry sometimes gets confused because of some good ethics committees, and sometimes ethics committee do not function as per frequency or the SOPs. And you rightly mentioned that the country is now focusing mainly on the trials of which are needed in India, particularly vaccines and maybe the other things. You also said, and I think Dr. Pramod Garg and Dr. Tripathi also said about the clinical trial related injuries and the regulations and the rules. In last few years, maybe 6 years if I say, or not even 6 years, last 4 years, there has been bombardment of regulatory reforms by the regulator. And these regulations are so many that we had to conduct a workshop across the country to make the ethics committee aware of these regulations. And Mr. Pradhan is the architect of most of these regulations. So it is our fortune that we are listening from the horse's mouth. Mr. Pradhan, why you think that suddenly so many regulations were introduced? What was the need? And what are the most important critical regulations in the clinical trial, which all people sitting here must know if they are involved or likely to be involved in a clinical trial?
Thank you, Chairman. And I would like to thank you, Dr. Shakti Gupta, for organizing such a nice conclave on very pertinent issues. And as regards to, sir, this regulatory regime of clinical trial in India, because we have covered a long journey so far as development of regulatory regime in clinical trial in India. I am not talking about other clinical research as well. Because as we know, first, this clinical trial concept was incorporated in Drugs and Cosmetics Rule in 1988. Before that, there was no legal, provisions or legal understanding on what is clinical trial and how to do and what is this. And that 1988 clinical trial regulation, there was a, very pertinent restriction, which we call phase lag. Phase lag means that time there was a restriction that if a drug is being tried in other countries, say at phase 2 or phase 3 level, then our country should permit one phase below the phase of clinical trial in other countries, considering the risk involved in, because that time we were not, so much experience or acquainted with new drug discovery research and what are the risks and issues, concerns involved in during drug discovery research. So therefore, that phase lag was there. That phase lag was there till 2005 when the amendment was made in 2005, where that phase lag was removed. Phase lag was removed means if a drug is being tried at phase 3 in USA or UK or European countries, so we can also grant permission to conduct the same phase of clinical trial concurrently. So that specific amendments actually resulted in many clinical trials coming to India from other from sponsor outside India, which we call global clinical trials, because in those cases the sponsor is based in USA or European Union or some other countries, but they want to get the clinical trial data generated from India. Why? Because as Professor Y.K. Gupta has already mentioned, that what are the advantages that India has so far as clinical trial is concerned. Obviously, we all know. But probably in 2005 amendments, this is a little bit relaxation, because we open the clinical trial regime allowing conduct of concurrent global clinical trials. At the same times, there are a lot of stringent measures were also incorporated, because before that the regulation, there are no specific responsibilities prescribed in the rules. So in 2005 amendments, one way that phase lag was removed, other way the responsibilities of sponsor, investigators and ethics committees were prescribed, and also the good clinical practice guidelines, which was prepared in line with the ICH guidelines or guidelines of US FDA or other developed countries, that was also made mandatory legally through amendments in 2005, that any clinical trial that is to be conducted, that they have to follow that good clinical trial practice, good clinical practice guidelines that was issued by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in 2001. Probably that time, maybe because of inexperience, because clinical trials and new drug discovery research was relatively new in India as compared to other developed countries, as you all know. So that time one thing was missed out, that what will happen if something goes wrong, if a patient suffers injury or death in clinical trial, then what will happen? So that time there was no regulation as such in 2005 regulations. So as a result of removal of phase lag, a number of clinical trials started coming to India, global clinical trials, and those were basically clinical trials of new chemical entities where the inherent risk is maximum as compared to approved molecules for some new route of indication or new claims or something. And that time, that regulatory provisions specifically how to address if a patient gets harms or if a patient get injury or if a patient die in clinical trial, then what will happen? So that was not there in our regulation in 2005. So when number of clinical trials started increasing from 2006, 7, 8, 9, so we got maximum clinical trials in 2010. That time we received application of around more than 350 applications. All I am talking about global clinical trials, and most of them were clinical trials of new chemical entities, phase 2, phase 3 basically. So as a result, obviously, because of inherent risk involved in clinical trials, there may be some some serious adverse events, there may be some injury, there may be some death. Now the death may be because of clinical trial, may not be because of the disease conditions of the patients, but there is no system, there is no structure how to assess those and how to address those issues, and what will happen if the any patient suffers injury because of clinical trials. So that issue started raising in various fora, starting from parliament, from media, from judiciary in various courts and NGOs and everybody, they started raising this issue that tell us how many patients have died, how many patients have been injured because of clinical trials, and what are the compensation that have been paid. So there are a lot of issue, hue and cry in parliament as such, and also in media, in parliament and judiciary also. And that time, every parliament session, there used to be one star question. Star question means our minister has to, reply upfront in the parliament, and the parliamentarian will ask questions about specific issues. So every parliament session, there used to be at least 3-4 parliament questions at number one. Number one means the first question will be the issues regarding these clinical trials, concerns. And that time there are a lot of other concerns also regarding functionings of ethics committee, because some ethics committees which were not associated with institutes, they were also reviewing clinical trial protocols and according approval, and the clinical trials were being conducted. So many other concerns were raised. As a result, what happened? Because obviously the responsibility of government is to provide public assurance that whatever is being done, clinical trial is being done, it is done as per regulatory guidelines, and all the safety, efficacy aspects and rights, safety and well-beings of the trials are protected. That is the responsibility of the government to provide public assurance. Obviously, when we reviewed that this regulatory provisions was warranted that time. And then the draft rule, obviously, regarding 3 main amendments were issued. One is procedures for examination of serious adverse events of injury, death in clinical trial. Other was, how to monitor the functioning of ethics committee, because there are a lot of concerns on functioning of ethics committees, and also what is the regulatory provisions regarding the actual functioning of clinical trial site or the investigators' activities in a particular site, how here they are doing or the. So therefore 3 main amendments were made in 2013. So obviously that time the rule making process, that time because of lot of concerns and this and involvement of many NGOs and patients groups, all were taken into consideration, all were taken into the part of rule making process, and regulatory provisions were made for these 3 important things. And the most important was that regulatory provisions regarding procedure for examination of SAE, serious adverse events, and payment of compensation. And that was the first time in the world. There are no such provisions in any country where regulatory authority is responsible for issuing orders that how much compensation will be given to a particular patient if the patient is suffered an injury and death which is found to be related to clinical trials. But at the same times, when these rules were incorporated in drugs and cosmetic rule in 2013, there are certain criteria we prescribed in the rules that if a patient suffers injury or death because of this, then that will be considered as clinical trial related injury or death. So two contentional criteria was that if a patient suffers because of lack of intended therapeutic effect of the investigational product, and other one is if the patient suffers injury or death because of use of placebo in a placebo control groups. So those two were controversial parameters, criteria. So later on, therefore, concerns were raised, and so many new regulations further those criteria were modified, and now as on today we can say that we have a balanced regulatory regime for conduct of clinical trials in our country. And as a result, we are seeing that yes, number of clinical trials started picking up. Gradually it will pick up. But the point is that challenges, because here we are discussing the regulatory and ethical challenges, the challenges are there with everybody, be it regulatory body or ethics committee or institution or investigators, challenges are there. Challenges, there are two things. One is challenges because of inherent, activities or inherent risk involved in clinical trials, inherent, difficulties, how to assess the risk versus benefit in a particular clinical trial proposals. That is a real challenge, because ethics committee, how to assess that yes, this particular proposal we have assessed its risk versus benefit, and we have found that in this case the patient you will be exposed to minimal risk. How to assess this specifically in phase 1 clinical trials or so those challenges are very important, and therefore I think this type of structured deliberation and conclave or workshop are very much necessary. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pradhan has given us a very comprehensive reason for the regulatory reforms which have recently been taken. And he also informed that today we are in a balanced stage. There were a lot of reforms done, and then there were a lot of correction. And now India is the first country in the world to develop the compensation for clinical trial related injury. And that is this only in India. And therefore, both of them, they expect that in future there will be more clinical trial opportunities in India, because the regulatory process is now stabilized and things are in order. With this, we complete the talk or the panel. If there is any question from the floor, maybe one or two, otherwise we disperse for lunch. Yes, one. And anybody else? Yes, please. Okay. You can use mic, yes, please.
Hello. My question is regarding thesis. In many parts of the country, medical student does thesis work, but when it comes to publication, the chief guide becomes the first author. So is it ethically allowed? And if not, how to deal with that?
I think the issue is somewhat different, but let me tell you, it all depends on who designed this study, whose concept was it. So many times the PhD student or the postgraduate student thinks that he owns the study. That may not be the case. So what we have done at AIIMS is that the chief guide is considered the principal investigator and for practical purposes, and the student is considered a co-investigator. Now, normally what happens is that the student is the first author and the chief guide is the last corresponding author. That's the usual practice. But in some cases, the guide may become the first author, depending on whose concept was it, who designed the study, who got the funding. So these are the issues.
No, because ethics is these grays areas. I am also senior resident, and in AIIMS this practice does not happen. But in medical college in various parts.
No, I understand your point. I'm saying that it all depends on who. You see, a resident does not really start the study. It is the guide who tells you do this study, this is the topic, this is the methodology, he gets the funding, he gets the patient. So just because resident has been involved in the conduct of study doesn't mean that he owns this study. So normally the resident becomes the first author, but it is possible that the guide may become the first author. That's all right.
Two ethics committee under two different registrations.
Yeah, you see, yeah. The point you are trying to mention that ethical aspects of other biomedical research may not be clinical trials. Clinical trial is specifically defined in our clinical trial rules.
No, I'm not talking about the clinical trials. I'm talking about the researches which has, for example, prevalence of obesity in the children 10 to 15 years. This sort of research papers which comes from the clinicians and from the courses which are run over there. So all this can because
so these are biomedical research, biomedical and health research. Actually, at present, obviously there is no specific rule or act to regulate biomedical research. At present, we have regulation act rules for clinical trials, which is covered under definition of clinical trials as mentioned in our drugs and cosmetics rules. But ICMR guidelines clearly mentions that any biomedical research on human participants, whether it risk is involved or not involved, that you cannot decide. That has to go through ethics committees approval, because ethics committee will assess the risk versus benefit. You yourself cannot decide that there is no harm. That committee has to, as Dr. Garg has already clearly mentioned. So biomedical ethical guidelines of biomedical research on human participants of ICMRs, that clearly mentions that any biomedical research or health research that has to go through ethics committee's review. Yes.
Any other questions? So the last question.
Sir, actually there is a consent form. Actually, generally the science is in English. So what the ethics committee expects is to translate it into Hindi.
I got your point. You're talking about the patient information sheet translation from English to Hindi. I got your point. This is not related to what we are discussing today, but in general, a best thing is to write first in Hindi yourself, in patient's language, layman's language. You translate it back into English, it's easier for you. Okay? What happens is people Google translate it. That should not be done. Okay?
How does the ethics committee asserts, like confirms that it is actually understandable to the patient?
No,
because
we
what
actually,
patient does is
no. Just a minute. Every protocol that comes to us, we read all the patient information ourselves. All the members read that. They read it themselves. Then only they can say it is right or wrong.
Are you talking about both the versions, Hindi as well as English?
Yeah. Yes, of course. So we have a social, we in the ethics committee, we have a layman who is part of the committee, layman, non-doctor. If he or she understands, then patient will understand. You have a non-scientific layman person in the committee itself.
You got your answer? Okay. So thank you very much, everybody.
I thank all the panelists for discussing the legal and ethical issues involved in clinical trials. May I now request Professor Y.K. Gupta to felicitate our valued panelists. Dr. A.K. Pradhan, Dr. C.D. Tripathi, Dr. Pramod Garg, Dr. Khalid Khan. It is our pleasure to invite Mr. Annaswamy Vaidheesh, Vice President South Asia and Managing Director India for GlaxoSmithKline Pharmaceuticals Limited. And we request him to present a token of appreciation to the moderator, Professor Y.K. Gupta. Thank you, sir.